Hello and welcome. It's Justin Johnson. I'm on the module DD211. But also, before I move out, I just want to speak to us as well. While studying, while doing anything you want to do in life, make sure you take a little bit of time out for your own well-being, your mental health. Look after your vitality as you study. When you study, make sure you reference your reading. You want to try and influence the youth of today to better their circumstance in life. Young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. You get to a point in life where you think, I've done everything I've wanted to in life and give up. Never give up. Always try and emphasize and stress, stress the circumstances of trying to better someone's well-being, their mentality. So anyway, we're on the module DD211. Understanding politics, ideas and institutions in the modern world. We're on chapter 19, culture, rights and justice in global politics. When you reference your reading, always go to the start of the book. It's edited by Richard Heffman, Simon Usherwood and Edward Westmisnter. It's published at Open University, Walton, Milton Keynes. First published 2015, second edition 2022. Anyway, chapter 19 to 216. 5. International justice. The distinctions between the cosmopolitan and the communitarian views on how to organise interaction on a global level can be further elucidated through debates on international justice and humanitarian intervention. While communitarians strongly support interpretation of the UN post-war settlement based on the principle of national self-determination, many cosmopolitans seek to go beyond that settlement. Those who endorse cosmopolitanism look forward to a further development and structure of global relations governed by the principle of universal rights, on which the exercise of national sovereignty is conditional on respect for human rights. Some, but not all, cosmopolitans wish to institutionalise this development in an international framework that would override the authority of nation states. For cosmopolitans, the idea of universal retributive justice follows logically from the notion of the universal human rights carrying citizen. Partly as a result of cosmopolitan ideas, the period since the Second World War, and particularly from the 1990s onwards, have seen significant moves to develop international law, policy making and practice in order to put some muscle into delivering international retributive justice. The aim of these developments is to enforce claims to rights and to progress efforts to codify limitations on state immunity. International justice, in this sense, has developed as one of the extensions of the meaning of rights. Thus, the 1990s saw the UN Security Council established ad hoc tribunals for war crimes in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the start of the UN and North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO, actions in Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and East Timor. These developments are proof of new extensions to international law and enhanced powers of intervention granted to international institutions and states in the name of human rights. New legal safeguards to protect minorities from oppression and persecution in both international and national courts are also becoming institutionalized. In the early 1990s, The Hague and Russia tribunals for war crimes were welcomed by many cosmopolitans as building on the legacy of the post-war Nuremberg trials. Subsequently, in 1998, in Rwandan tribunal sentenced the former Prime Minister and head of the Rwandan government, Jean Kambanda, to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity. The Rwandan case is particularly instructive as it is laid the basis for a new normative structure for humanitarian intervention that international community has adopted in the form of the responsibility to protect her, which will be discussed later. In 1994, approximately 800,000 people were massacred in the inter-ethnic violence between the majority Hutu and minority Tutsi populations in Rwanda. The majority of those killed were Tutsis. in what is now considered an act of genocide. The massacres followed years of ethnic tensions between the groups, which had its roots of colonial times. The Belgian colonists promoted Tustis, who they considered to be superior over Hustis, while the Hustis regained power upon Rwandan's independence in 1962. Tensions between the two communities continued in the following decades. Tutsis were held responsible for the killing of Rwanda's Hutu. President ℙ𝕠𝕝𝕤𝕤 in 1994. This subsequently led to the genocide, which also saw moderate Hutus massacred by extremist Hutu militias. The international community who powerless to prevent the genocide occurring. UN peacekeepers who had been present in the country withdrew after 10 of their numbers were killed at the start of the genocide. The one state with the ability to intervene with sufficient power, the United States, was hesitant to do so on account of its experience in Somalia. When many troops had been killed on a humanitarian mission in 1992, when international support would eventually arrive, the massacres had finished. A large portion of Hutu population fled to the neighbouring Democratic Republic of Congo. In light of the new government led by Tutsis and a moderate Hutsis retaking the Rwandan capital, Kigali. Hey, ℂ𝕧𝕕𝕤𝕦𝕦𝕦𝕦𝕦. The fact that the international community was hesitant to intervene and prevent the genocide led to a debate over the capacity for states to intervene and effectively challenge another state's sovereign rights. If human rights were being abused, subsequent decisions among international experts sought to redefine sovereignty as not only entailing rights but also responsibilities to protect their citizens. Responsibility to protect. Intervention on humanitarian grounds has now arguably become something of the norm in international affairs. A good example of how this works in practice can be seen in the development of the responsibility to protect, often abbreviated as R2P, which came about as a result of the international community's failure to adequately respond to the Rwandan genocide in 1994 and the ℎ𝕕𝕤𝕤𝕤𝕤 massacre in 1995. It is not a law as such, but has become a norm of international affairs and persists as sovereignty no longer exclusively protects states from foreign interference. It is a charge of responsibility that holds states accountable for the welfare of their people. United Nations. The R2P has 3 pillars. The state that carries the primary responsibility for protecting population from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing and their incitement. The international community has a responsibility to encourage and assist states in fulfilling this responsibility. The international community has a responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other means to protect population from these crimes. If a state is manifestly failing to protect its populations, an international community must be prepared to take collective action to protect populations. In accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, this had significant implications for state sovereignty, as this is no longer a guarantee of a state's protection. As such, we have seen R2P invoked in several crises since its enshrinement at the UN in 2005 for example, post-election violence in Kenya in 2007-8, and in Côte d'Ivoire in 2011. R2P was also cited in UN Security Council decision to permit military intervention in Libya in 2011. The R2P decision to permit military intervention in Libya in 2010, the R2P principle has been criticised, however, particularly by voices on the left, such as the US intellectual Noam Chomsky and leaders such as former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. For one, only being applied selectively and given mandate for powerful states to intervene in other countries' affairs, for example, while R2P was used to justify intervention against the historically anti-Western regime of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. There was no such use of the concept towards the West Coast Ali Bahrain, where a crackdown on dissent was ongoing at the same time. The failure to apply R2P in the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, also underlined the continued weight of the other geopolitical considerations in whether to act. Of particular importance also is the establishment of the International Criminal Court. In 1998, important steps were taken towards setting up a permanent ICCC with jurisdiction over individuals accused of serious war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. It is an institution with overarching global competence, expressing a cosmopolitan commitment to the principle of reason in the international public sphere. Furthermore, the only body with the authority to override an ICC's decision is the UN Security Council by unanimous vote. Military and human interventionism. While the ICC may be one of the clearest examples of a cosmopolitan effort at a global justice institution building it so far, it is not the only one. The move towards cosmopolitan global institutions and that extended beyond the UN's original goals and values speeded up considerably during the 1990s indeed. Some define the period immediately following the Cold War as a golden era for humanitarian interventions. Cosmopolitans would contend that international institution building does not necessarily lead to more interventionism. Humanitarians such as Chandler see it as a significant that in the field of international human rights, interventionism, the shift in policy practice has been institutionalized on ad hoc manner through the UN Security Council, since 1990 has empowered itself to consider humanitarian emergencies as a threat to international peace and security. The first Gulf War to liberate the Kuwait in 1991 was followed by the international community attempt to set up a safe haven policy to protect the human rights of the Kurds and Marsh Arabs in Iraq. The international regulation of Iraq, through the establishment of the no-fly zones and US provisions to prevent Iraq from developing weapons of mass destruction and limiting trade with other states, represented a crucially significant legal precedent whereby a state's sovereignty was subordinated to human rights concerns. The legal precedent for universal human rights based on intervention was invoked in 1992, the UN authorization of the unilateral US intervention to protect humanitarian food convoys in Somalia. The precedent was also used in 1993 when the UN authorized a multilateral military intervention in Bosnia to protect humanitarian aid, and again 2 years later when a NATO force was mandated to impose a peace settlement in 1999. International military action against Yugoslavia over the Kosovo crisis was widely regarded as the first international military intervention against a sovereign state for purely human rights reasons. A key articulation of this form of intervention come when the former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair launched his idea of an international community at a speech in Chicago in 1999. He proposed that states should intervene in others to prevent humanitarian crises using language of just war, based in the eyes of values rather than territorial ambition, to justify NATO then intervention in Kosovo. While the humanitarian pretext was clear in Kosovo case, although not completely devoid of wider geopolitical considerations as regards NATO and Russian support for Siberia, the doctrine was subsequently applied to the consecutive UK military operations such as in Iraq, with the language of rights being used as a retrospective justification for the ousting of Saddam Hussein. And Afghanistan. The language of human rights was also used by the US and the UK as a framework for the war on terrorism after the events of 11 September 2001. Some cosmopolitan advocates of universal human rights might applaud what they see as a significant extension of the competence of the UN, from being charged with standard setting, monitoring and extending pressure on states to comply with human rights norms. The UN is now very much in the game of intervention. Chandler is critical of the enhanced role of the UN Security Council and argues that it has a fundamental transform from being a policeman of international security, concerned with the welfare of the states, to supranational government and an administration body supporting the human rights of citizens in situations of complex political emergencies. Those administrative powers were later extended on an indefinite basis and, in 1999, The UN acquired further powers of administrative regulation in Kosovo and East Timor. Although an active UN presence indicates the organisation's commitment to intervention on humanitarian grounds, one could debate how successful this intervention has been. It does, for example, being present in a peacekeeping guise imply action. There have been occasions when UN peacekeepers have made to stand by the voice violence when have been occurring. The UN has had staff and peacekeeping forces on the ground of Israel, Palestine since 1948. And yet conflict has remained a depressingly regular theme in a part of the world. Also, while the UN peacekeepers have been brought in to protect human rights, in some cases the peacekeepers themselves have been accused of gross rights violations, as in the accusations of rape and complicity in prostitution in a number of African peacekeeping ventures. Conclusion. This chapter has explored different perspectives on global rights debate and complexities of the competing positions within the field of global political relations. It started by situating human rights in a global arena, emphasising the universalist aspiration of global rights discourse. The universalism of global rights discourse can be challenged from a number of different positions. Arguments emphasising specific cultural and political context in which rights discourse was born. Feminist critics, who has the right to claim against whom, and the issue of individual rights trumping state sovereignty. Following on from this, the chapter looked at debates around the notion of human rights in a global arena, exploring two perspectives of cosmopolitanism and communitarianism, two normative approaches that seek to explain how human rights should be realised in global politics. The cosmopolitan position can be seen in a way that bodies such as UN regularly place emphases on universal concerns over national ones. In contrast, emphasising cultural identity leads to a humanitarian view that rights and justice are culturally specific and cannot and should not be applied across borders. The chapter then revisited globalisation and how this can be linked to global rights discourse. It explored how the global propagation of rights and values can be linked to a rights discourse that is historically rooted in Western political traditions. Although that caveat that not all cosmopolitan claims for the universal rights need to come from that. As evidenced by the work of post-colonial theorists, this was contrasted through revisiting humanitarianism in the context of culturally defined alternative rights discourse, although again with an emphasis on different positions within the debate. Thus, the encounter between global rights and national or regional cultures should be exclusively understood as a process imposing one's culture upon another, or as a clash of different cultural systems. You also explore briefly how this actually tells us something about power politics, in the sense that culture define the strategies are used as a resource in the struggle for economic and political power in the international system. Finally, the chapter examined the issue of humanitarian intervention, exploring how states and other organisations have utilised the rights discourse in global politics. The example discussed in this section. It highlighted how the language of rights had been utilised to justify intervention, and even retrospectively in the case of US-led ousting Saddam Hussein in Iraq, while a cosmopolitan fixture of sorts can be seen in the establishment of a normative structure for defence of human rights, as seen in R2P. Global power politics initially stymied its application in Syria, stung by the regime change that followed the campaign against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, in which R2P was invoked, but essentially used to justify regime change. Russia and China vetoed military intervention against Syria at the UN Security Council. Interestingly, in the case of Syria, part of the response came from regional states looking to justify their own hopes for regime change in Syria. But ironically, nearly all of them head up authoritarian regimes. Thus, the rights and responsibility of states to protect their civilians become subsumed in regional and global struggles for political influence. That will do for reading.